Deep in the forgotten valleys of Appalachia stands a weathered cabin, its windows like hollow eyes staring across decades of abandonment. Local folks drive past it without a second glance, calling it that old Thompson place. Unsalvageable, they say. When Mason Reeves first saw it, others saw rotting timber and a collapsing roof. He saw possibility. With calloused hands, from years of mountain living and a stubbornness passed down through generations, Mason emptied his modest savings account for a property nobody wanted. The realtor actually laughed when he signed the papers. What secrets would those century-old walls reveal once he began tearing them down? Could this abandoned shell truly become something worth saving? Or had Mason just made the biggest mistake of his life? Mason Reeves stared at the weathered wooden toolbox resting on his kitchen table. The hand-carved initials JR on its side, for Joseph Reeves, his grandfather, were worn smooth from decades of calloused fingers opening and closing the lid. Inside lay the treasures that had built 3 generations of mountain homes. Hand planes with handles polished by sweat, chisels kept razor sharp, and a folding ruler with measurements worn nearly invisible. "You sure about this, son?" his father had asked when Mason mentioned the cabin. At 58, Daniel Reeves still framed houses with the same precision he'd learned from his father, though arthritis was beginning to curl his fingers like the mountain laurel roots that clung to rocky hillsides. "I'm sure, Dad." Mason ran his hand over the tools. "Grandpa always said a man should build something that outlasts him. Growing up in these hills meant learning to work wood before you learned to drive." By 12, Mason could identify trees by their bark and grain. By 16, he'd helped his grandfather restore the family's front porch, learning how to sister joists and match century-old beadboard. Even when his high school friends headed for cities and college campuses, Mason remained, drawn to the heritage that seemed embedded in his DNA like the rings in an oak. Now at 28, Mason had built a modest reputation locally. "Reeves can fix anything with wood in it," folks would say, calling him for porch repairs, cabinet installations, and custom furniture. The work paid bills, but left little for savings. Each job was fulfilling but temporary. Fix and move on, creating nothing that was truly his own. The economy had hit the mountains hard. Fewer new homes meant fewer framing jobs. Custom woodworking became a luxury many couldn't afford. Mason worked longer hours for less pay, drifting between job sites, living in the small apartment above his workshop that always felt temporary. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory during late nights planing lumber or early mornings estimating materials. "Good work ain't never wasted, boy. Might not see the value today, but solid craftsmanship always finds its worth." Mason first spotted the cabin while delivering lumber to a hunting camp 2 valleys over. Just a glimpse through winter-bare trees, a sagging roofline, nearly swallowed by rhododendron thickets. Something about its defiant presence against decades of neglect pulled him off the road on his return trip. Up close, the devastation was clear. Collapsed porch, windows long gone, half the roof open to sky. But the bones remained. Hand-hewn logs notched by someone who understood how to make wood, locked together without nails. The foundation stones had been placed with such precision that even a century of freeze-thaw cycles hadn't shifted. Them more than an inch, Mason circled the structure 3 times before climbing through a window frame. Inside, beneath fallen ceiling plaster and raccoon droppings, wide plank pine floors had protected themselves with a patina of dirt. He knelt, scraping away debris with his pocket knife to reveal honey-colored wood underneath. The grain was tight, old-growth timber that couldn't be bought anymore at any price. "You still got something to say," he whispered to the silent walls. That evening, Mason called the number on the ancient "for sale" sign leaning against a tree. The county records office revealed more. The property had changed hands twice in 40 years, neither owner doing more than paying minimal taxes. The last resident had been a Thompson, sometime in the early 1970s, when Mason mentioned his interest to locals at the hardware store. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. "That old place is more trouble than it's worth," said Pete behind the counter. "Foundation's probably crumbling. Roof's half gone. Thompson place been empty since I was a kid, added an elderly man examining drill bits. Heard they couldn't keep it up after their boy died in Vietnam. Someone said there's black mold throughout, offered another. Cheaper to bulldoze than fix, but Mason had spent his life learning how to see past surface damage. Where others saw collapse, he recognized original craftsmanship worth salvaging. Where they saw insurmountable work, he calculated labor he could provide with his own 2 hands. That night, Mason emptied his toolbox on his apartment floor, inventorying what he had against what he'd need. His savings account held just enough for a down payment if the owner was motivated to sell. It would leave nothing for materials, but he'd figure that out as he went. His grandfather had built their family home from lumber he'd milled himself. Maybe it was time for Mason to do the same. The next morning, he called the realtor again and made an offer. The realtor's sedan wasn't built for mountain roads. Janice Miller winced with each pothole, her professional smile faltering as gravel pinged against the undercarriage. Mason had insisted they meet at the property rather than reviewing photographs in her office. Most folks prefer seeing the interior photos first, she said, parking beside Mason's truck. Saves everybody time. Mason was already walking the perimeter. I've seen enough to know I'm interested. Janice sighed, retrieving a folder stamped with her agency's logo. The Thompson property has been listed on and off for almost 20 years. I should warn you, it hasn't exactly been maintained. The folder contained a single sheet, a property deed from 1892 with yellowed edges and faded ink. Each subsequent owner had been recorded in increasingly modern handwriting. The final transfer dated 1978. Original documentation, Janice explained. The county digitized most records, but this one's been passed along with the property. Previous owners were superstitious about separating the deed from the land. Mason traced the first name with his finger. Thomas Thompson. Local family. Built most of the original structures in this valley before the Depression. This was their homestead, she paused. I should disclose that 3 potential buyers have backed out after inspections. The most recent contractor estimated $60,000 minimum just to make it habitable. Mason folded the deed carefully. I'd like to make an offer. Without an inspection. I've been building and restoring structures my whole life. I've done my inspection. Janice's professional veneer cracked. Mr. Reeves, I can't in good conscience sell this property without making certain you understand what you're getting into. The foundation has shifted. There's extensive water damage. The electrical, if there ever was any, would need complete replacement. I'm aware. The current owner is an investment company that acquired it in a portfolio sale. They've authorized me to accept virtually any reasonable offer just to unload it. Mason named a figure that represented nearly his entire savings. Janice looked genuinely pained. That's more than they're expecting. She hesitated. I could probably get it for you for 2/3 that amount. I'm offering what I think it's worth. The paperwork took less than an hour. By early afternoon, Mason held the keys to a property that barely had functioning locks anymore, along with the yellowed deed bearing his name as the newest entry. Janice shook his hand with a mixture of professional courtesy and personal concern. The locals have stories about this place, she said as she prepared to leave. Nothing specific, just the usual mountain superstitions about abandoned properties. Bad luck and such. I don't put much stock in luck, Mason replied. Good or bad. After her car disappeared down the gravel road, Mason stood alone on his property. His property. The reality of it settled on his shoulders. Not just the opportunity, but the weight of responsibility. The cabin seemed to watch him, its empty window frames like questioning eyes. He retrieved his sleeping bag and cooler from his truck. The sun would set in a few hours, and he had no intention of driving back to town. Tonight would be his first on the land, even if the cabin wasn't ready to shelter him. Mason built a small fire near the truck and heated a can of stew as darkness gathered around him. Night in the mountains had its own personality, deeper, more absolute than in town, with its streetlights and porch lamps. Here, the darkness had texture, broken only by stars and the occasional distant gleam from another homestead miles away. An owl called from somewhere nearby. Something small rustled in the underbrush. Mason leaned back against his truck tire and considered the silhouette of the cabin against the night sky. Tomorrow the real work would begin, but tonight was for listening to the land, getting acquainted with its rhythms and voice. Sleep came in fits and starts, his body adjusting to the hard ground and unfamiliar sounds. Just before dawn, Mason woke fully and stepped away from his truck to relieve himself. The first hint of light outlined the eastern ridge, and in that grey half-light, the cabin's true condition revealed itself with brutal honesty. What had seemed like a romantic challenge in yesterday's enthusiasm now stood as a stark reality. The roof sagged dangerously in the center. The back wall leaned several degrees off plumb. What he had taken for shadows yesterday were actually holes in the log walls, where entire sections had rotted away. Mason took a deep breath of the cool mountain air, tasting the hint of pine and loamy soil. The doubt that had crept in during the night didn't vanish, but it settled somewhere manageable inside him. He'd known this wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was. As the sun crested the ridge, Mason opened his grandfather's toolbox and selected a measuring tape. Time to get started. Mason spread his hand-drawn plans across the hood of his truck. The pencil sketches showed the cabin from multiple angles, existing conditions on the left pages, proposed renovations on the right. His grandfather had taught him to visualize the finished project before removing a single nail. Your mind's eye needs to see it whole before your hands start breaking it apart, he'd say. The morning light revealed challenges invisible during yesterday's excitement. The cabin sat slightly askew on its foundation, listing toward the creek like a ship taking on water. Mason circled the structure, tapping logs with his hammer and listening to the hollow responses that indicated rot or insect damage. "Let's see what we're really dealing with," he muttered. Selecting a pocket knife from his tool belt, the exterior logs told a complex story. The south-facing wall had weathered badly, its surface degraded by decades of harsh sun and driving rain. The north wall, more protected from elements, remained surprisingly sound. Mason probed each suspicious area, cataloging the damage in a small notebook. Inside, conditions worsened. The roof's partial collapse had allowed years of rain to penetrate, creating ideal conditions for decay. Mason knelt to examine the floor joists visible through broken floorboards. He poked his knife into what should have been solid wood, watching with dismay as it sank in like butter. "That's not good," he whispered. A support beam that bore the weight of the second-floor joists had rotted nearly through at its center. Mason lay flat on his stomach, shining his flashlight into the crawl space beneath the cabin. What he saw made his heart sink. The center sill beam, essentially the cabin's spine, showed signs of extensive termite damage. Back outside, Mason amended his sketches, marking newly discovered problems with red X's. The list of repairs grew longer by the minute. He'd need to jack up the entire structure to replace the foundation sill. The floor system would require significant reconstruction. Most roof rafters would need replacement. Even many of the wall logs, which he'd hoped to preserve, would need partial or complete rebuilding. Mason calculated rough material costs in the margins of his notebook. Lumber prices alone would consume most of his remaining savings. Then there were roofing materials, fasteners, tools he didn't yet own, rentals for equipment too expensive to purchase outright. The numbers quickly outpaced his budget. He returned to his truck and pulled out a cooler containing his lunch, a sandwich and an apple. As he ate, Mason reviewed his options. He could scale back the project, fixing only what was necessary to make part of the cabin habitable. He could seek loans, though banks were reluctant to finance projects like this without collateral. He could look for reclaimed materials, salvaging what he needed from demolition sites or abandoned structures, or he could reduce his biggest expense, housing, by living on site. Mason eyed the flat area near the cabin where he'd parked his truck. It would accommodate a tent. High summer was approaching, the perfect season for camping. By winter, he might have enough of the cabin restored to provide shelter. The decision crystallized as he finished his lunch. Mason made a new page in his notebook, creating a prioritized task list that began with "set up camp" and ended with "move in." Between those bookends lay hundreds of hours of labor, but breaking the mammoth project into manageable pieces made it seem possible. He returned to the cabin with renewed purpose, taking detailed measurements of each component that would need replacement. The original builders had used traditional dimensions, nothing standardized about these timbers. Each piece would need to be custom cut. Mason sketched full-scale profiles of unique joinery he discovered, determined to replicate the craftsmanship where possible. Late afternoon brought another revelation. Behind layers of deteriorated modern materials, Mason uncovered the cabin's original floors, wide pine planks that might be salvageable with careful attention. Similarly, the stone fireplace, though cracked in places, could be repaired rather than rebuilt. As the sun dipped low, Mason added a final note to his plans. Preserve what can be saved. Replace what must be replaced. Honor the original in everything. He folded the drawings carefully and returned them to his truck. Tomorrow, he would drive to town for supplies. Tonight, he would sleep under the stars once more, listening to the cabin settle and creak around him like an old man telling stories too valuable to forget. The rhythmic swing of Mason's machete sliced through decades of overgrowth. 3 days into clearing the property, his arms burned with fatigue, but satisfaction fueled each stroke. Gradually, the cabin's surroundings emerged from wilderness, a property revealing itself like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Beneath tangled brambles and volunteer saplings lay the ghosts of human intention, stone borders outlining what must have been garden beds, a path of flat stones leading to where an outhouse once stood, the rusted remains of a hand pump indicating a well. Mason paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the day's progress. The immediate area around the cabin now stood relatively clear, allowing proper access to all sides of the structure. He'd created a growing brush pile for burning once it dried and stacked potentially useful logs for later milling. Kneeling to clear a particularly stubborn patch of blackberry canes, Mason's machete struck something metal. He scraped away soil with gloved hands to reveal a horseshoe, its iron nearly dissolved by decades of mountain rain, but still recognizably U-shaped. "Well, hello there," he murmured, brushing away dirt. The horseshoe was hand-forged, lacking the machine precision of modern ones. Mason turned it over in his palm, feeling a connection to the unknown hands that had hammered it into shape and nailed it to some long-gone horse's hoof. "That's from old Thompson, I expect," Mason started at the voice. At the newly cleared edge of the property stood an elderly man leaning on a walking stick, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Didn't mean to startle you," the man continued. "Name's Harold Jenkins. I live about half a mile down the ridge." He gestured vaguely eastward. "Saw somebody finally working on the Thompson place," Mason introduced himself, walking over to shake the man's weathered hand. "That horseshoe's probably from Thomas Thompson's draft horse," Harold explained, eyeing Mason's find. "Samson, they called him. Helped clear this whole hillside back when it was nothing but virgin timber. You knew the Thompsons?" Mason asked, surprised. "Knew the later generations. My daddy knew Thomas himself." Harold surveyed the property with eyes that seemed to see both past and present simultaneously. This was quite the homestead in its day. "Orchard over there," he pointed to the western slope. "Kitchen garden behind the house. They grew most everything they needed right here." Harold accepted Mason's invitation to sit on a fallen log. As they shared the water from Mason's canteen, the old man spoke of the property as it had been, the apple and pear trees that once produced fruit, abundant enough to trade with neighbors, the spring-fed well that never ran dry even in drought years. The way the cabin had served as an unofficial community gathering place for holidays before the road to town was improved. Last Thompson to live here was Robert. Bobby, to those who knew him. Went to Vietnam in '68, came back in a box. Harold's voice softened. His parents couldn't bear to stay after that. Place has been empty since, more or less. Someone bought it in the '80s, talked big about restoration, but nothing came of it. No one's attempted any repairs. Mason asked, "Folks around here are practical. Once a place starts going back to nature, most figure that's nature's right." Harold studied Mason. "You're not from around here originally, are you?" "Born and raised about 40 miles north," Mason replied. "My family's been in these mountains for generations." This seemed to satisfy Harold. He nodded thoughtfully. "Mountain folk understand certain things lowlanders don't, like how to work with the land instead of against it." As the afternoon light began to soften, Harold stood to leave. "You've taken on quite the project. If you're interested in knowing more about this place, my sister Rebecca has all the old family albums. Thompsons were in half of them, being neighbors for so long." Mason walked the old man to the edge of the clearing. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Jenkins. I want to restore this place properly, honor what it was while making it livable again." "Call me Harold," the old man said. "And I'll bring Rebecca by sometime. She'll talk your ear off about how this valley used to be." He paused, looking back at the cabin. "You know, that place hasn't looked this cared for in 40 years. Bobby would have liked seeing someone giving it attention again." After Harold disappeared down the overgrown path, Mason returned to the horseshoe. He placed it carefully on a flat stone near his tent, the first recovered artifact of what he suspected would be many. The physical connection to the land's history felt important, a talisman of continuity amid the drastic changes he was making. As evening approached, Mason lit a small fire and heated his dinner. For the first time, he could clearly see the cabin from his campsite without intervening brush. It looked different now, less abandoned, more expectant. Mason knelt beside the cornerstone, brushing decades of accumulated soil from its face. The numbers emerged slowly, 1892, the foundation's birth year, carved by hands long since returned to dust. He traced the digits with his fingertip, feeling the deliberate chisel marks that had withstood 133 years of mountain seasons. "You've held on this long," he murmured to the stone. "Just need you to stay put a little longer." After 2 weeks of clearing and assessment, Mason had reached his first major structural challenge. The foundation had shifted, causing the cabin to slowly slide downhill. This wasn't unexpected in a structure this old. Mountain buildings were in constant conversation with gravity, but addressing it would require carefully orchestrated steps to avoid catastrophic collapse. Mason had spent evenings researching traditional foundation repair techniques. His laptop balanced on a camp table, cellular hotspot straining for signal. He'd studied methods from Appalachian preservation websites and watched videos from restoration experts. Now theory would meet practice. The plan was straightforward but precarious. Systematically place hydraulic jacks at critical points, gradually lift the structure, remove compromised foundation stones, rebuild the foundation sections, then slowly lower the cabin back onto its renewed base. Simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Mason positioned his first jack beneath the southeast corner sill where the slope was steepest. He'd start with just a 1/4-inch lift, enough to relieve pressure, but not enough to destabilize the already compromised structure. The jack handle creaked as he pumped it, metal straining against the immense weight above. A sharp crack split the air. Mason jumped back as a support beam shifted unexpectedly, sending a cascade of debris down from the cabin's interior. The entire southeast corner had dropped several inches, the jack tipping sideways under sudden, uneven pressure. "No, no, no," Mason muttered, scrambling to assess the damage. The sill beam had split longitudinally, creating a catastrophic failure point. Any additional movement might send the entire corner collapsing down the hillside. Hands shaking, Mason grabbed his phone and called the only person he could think of who might help, Frank Whitley, his former mentor who specialized in historical renovations. "Slow down, son," Frank said after Mason's rushed explanation. "You trying to jack the whole corner at once?" "I thought—" "That's your first mistake. Thinking instead of knowing." Frank's voice was gruff but not unkind. "Where are your support cribs? You got temporary bracing inside?" Mason's silence answered for him. Frank sighed. "You can't just lift a structure that old without creating a temporary framework first. Those old timbers have memory. They've settled into position over decades. Force them to move, and they'll fight you every inch." By sunset, Frank's truck rumbled up the overgrown drive, loaded with timber for bracing and cribbing blocks. The older man, bearded and barrel-chested in his 60s, surveyed the situation with narrowed eyes. "Could be worse," he finally declared. "Corner's compromised but salvageable. We'll need to work through the night to secure it before those clouds bring rain." Under Frank's guidance, they first built an interior bracing system, a web of temporary supports that would prevent further collapse. Then they constructed cribbing towers beside each jack point, essential safeguards that would catch the weight if a jack failed. "Foundation work is more art than science," Frank explained as they positioned a new jack. "These old places weren't built with levels and lasers. They followed the land's contours, adapted to what was there. They worked through night and into morning, lifting the structure mere millimeters at a time, allowing the ancient timbers to adjust gradually. When dawn broke, the critical corner stood 2 inches higher, now supported by a carefully constructed crib of 6 by 6 timbers. "Now for the real work," Frank said, pointing to the exposed foundation stones. "Those need to come out one by one, and new ones mortared in their place. Stone by stone, no shortcuts." Mason studied the foundation's construction, irregular fieldstones gathered from the property, fitted together through trial and error rather than formal masonry. The original builders had used a lime mortar that had largely weathered away, leaving the stones essentially dry-stacked. How did they manage this with hand tools? Mason wondered aloud. "They had something better than power tools," Frank replied. "Time and patience, something modern builders have forgotten." By afternoon, they had replaced the first critical foundation stones, using a mixture of original stones where possible and new ones where necessary. Frank showed Mason how to mix a traditional lime mortar that would allow the foundation to breathe, preventing trapped moisture from accelerating decay. "Modern materials would kill this cabin," Frank explained. "It needs to expand, contract, breathe like it always has. Match the methods that got it this far, and it'll outlive us both." As they cleaned their tools in the creek, Frank gestured toward the cabin. "You've got yourself a 100-year project there. You know that, right?" Mason nodded, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress. "I'm counting on it." The bulletin board outside Wilson's General Store had served as the community's information hub for generations. Amid notices for church potlucks and used tractors for sale, Mason pinned his handwritten message, looking for weekend help at the old Thompson cabin restoration. "Lunch provided. Experience with traditional building methods appreciated but not required. Willing to teach, learn." He'd added his phone number with reluctance. Pride had kept him working alone for nearly a month, but reality had set in after Frank's departure. Some tasks simply required more than 2 hands, and his timeline was slipping further behind with each passing day. Mason pushed his cart through the store, adding items to his already strained budget. The cashier, a woman in her 50s with a name tag reading Doris, studied his supplies: linseed oil, beeswax, and that much coffee. "You must be the fellow working on the Thompson place," she said, scanning his items. Mason nodded, surprised. "Word travels," Doris explained. "Harold Jenkins told his sister Rebecca, who told half the senior center, who told everyone else." She bagged his purchases efficiently. "My husband Joe might be interested in your bulletin board notice. Retired carpenter. Gets restless on weekends." Mason thanked her, expecting nothing. Small towns ran on such pleasantries, offers, that dissolved once spoken aloud. Saturday morning proved him wrong. He was wrestling a 12-foot beam into position when the sound of vehicles approaching made him turn. A caravan of 3 pickup trucks wound up his drive, each loaded with tools and people. Joe from the general store stepped out first, followed by 2 middle-aged men and a woman who looked to be in her 70s. "Hope we're not too early," Joe called. "Brought some folks who might be useful." Introductions revealed a retired electrician, a hobbyist blacksmith, and Rebecca Jenkins, Harold's sister, and apparently the community's unofficial historian. Each had brought tools, expertise, and a thermos of coffee. "We've been watching this place fall apart for decades," said Rebecca, surveying the progress Mason had made. "About time someone showed it some respect." Their arrival transformed Mason's solitary rhythm into something communal and surprisingly efficient. Joe examined Mason's bracing system with approval before suggesting refinements. The electrician, Mike, assessed possibilities for future wiring that wouldn't compromise the structure's integrity. Rebecca walked the perimeter, pointing out where original outbuildings had stood and identifying remnant plantings from the old homestead gardens. Tom, the blacksmith, studied the antique hardware Mason had been cleaning. "I could reproduce any of these pieces that are too damaged," he offered. "Got most of the traditional patterns in my workshop. Been collecting them for years." By midday, they had accomplished what would have taken Mason a full week alone. The main support beam was in place, secured by wooden pegs Tom had brought along, no modern nails that would eventually rust and compromise the wood. During lunch, Rebecca produced a folder of old photographs. "Thought you might want to see what you're working toward," she said, sliding a black and white image across the makeshift table. The photograph, taken sometime in the 1930s, judging by the clothes, showed the Thompson cabin in its prime, a sturdy, welcoming structure with a covered porch and smoke curling from the chimney. A family of 5 posed proudly in front, parents, 2 boys and a girl. "That's Thomas Jr. with his family," Rebecca explained. "His father built the original cabin, but Jr. made most of the additions you see here, the expanded porch. The second chimney on the north side." Mason studied the image, mentally comparing it to his own plans. He'd been remarkably close in his assessment of the original design, but the photograph revealed details he'd missed. Decorative trim along the eaves, a particular window configuration in the upper story. "There's more where that came from," Rebecca said. "I've got albums full of this valley's history. The Thompsons were good about documenting their place." As afternoon stretched on, Joe mentioned other community members with potential interest in the project. Pete's grandson, Ben, is studying historic preservation at college in Asheville, home for the summer with nothing much to do. And Sarah Lewis has been looking for somewhere to practice her traditional plastering techniques. The idea of regular help both tempted and concerned Mason. "I can't pay much." "Did anyone ask about money?" Rebecca interrupted with a raised eyebrow. "Some things aren't about payment. This cabin's part of our community story. Folks around here understand the value in preserving that." As they packed up tools at day's end, plans had already formed for the following weekend. Tom would bring patterns for replacement hardware. Mike would map a minimally invasive electrical plan. Joe had a line on salvaged, period-appropriate floorboards from a demolished 1900 schoolhouse 1 county over. Mason watched their trucks disappear. Down the drive, the property suddenly quiet again. The day's progress was evident everywhere he looked. In the newly secured beam, the cleared chimney, the organized salvage materials. On his camp table sat Rebecca's contribution, a handwritten list of community members with specific skills, each name followed by a phone number and notes about their expertise. At the top, she'd written, "Mountain folk take care of what matters. This cabin matters." The tin box emerged from the wall cavity like a time capsule, undisturbed since its placement decades ago. Mason had been carefully removing damaged siding when his pry bar dislodged something metallic that clattered to the floorboards. An old tobacco tin, its lid sealed shut with age and humidity. Mason sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, gently working the edges of the lid with his pocket knife. The box opened with a soft pop, revealing a stack of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, their paper yellowed but intact. The top envelope bore elegant script, "My dearest Thomas." Mason hesitated, suddenly aware of the intimacy of his discovery. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were private communications never intended for outside eyes. Rebecca Jenkins would know what to do with them. He set the tin aside and continued working, but his thoughts kept returning to the box, wondering what stories it contained. That evening, Rebecca arrived with her promised photo albums. Her eyes widened at the sight of the tin. "May I?" she asked, hands already reaching. Mason nodded. She handled the letters with reverence, carefully untying the ribbon. These appear to be from Elizabeth to Thomas Thompson, the original builder. They were courting while he was establishing this homestead. She gently unfolded the top letter, scanning the faded handwriting. "Listen to this. I dream of the home you describe, with the morning light streaming through eastern windows and the porch where we shall watch our children play. Though I remain in Charlottesville until spring, my heart already dwells in those mountains with you." Mason pictured the east-facing windows, now empty of glass, and the collapsed porch where generations of Thompson children had indeed played. Rebecca continued through several letters, constructing a narrative of the cabin's earliest days. Thomas had come ahead in 1891, selected the site for its spring and southern exposure, and spent a year building the cabin before sending for Elizabeth. The letters chronicled her anticipation, his progress reports, and details about the surrounding community as it formed. "These are priceless," Rebecca said, "not just for the Thompson family history, but for documenting early settlement in this part of the county." She looked up at Mason. "Would you consider donating these to our historical society? We could properly preserve them, make copies for you, and use them to create a more complete record of this cabin's significance." Mason agreed readily. The letters belonged to the community's shared heritage, not just to the current owner of the property. As Rebecca carefully repacked the tin, Mason returned to removing damaged boards. Another discovery soon followed. A section of original wallpaper preserved behind a built-in cabinet, its pattern of delicate blue flowers still vibrant where it had been protected from light and weather. "That's it!" Rebecca exclaimed, flipping through her album to find a particular photograph. "Look here, this interior shot from about 1910 shows this same wallpaper pattern in what they called the good room. Elizabeth ordered it specially from a catalogue. The historical society connection proved invaluable. By week's end, Rebecca had arranged for the county historian to visit, bringing survey records and tax documents dating back to the cabin's construction. These materials revealed that the property had once encompassed nearly 80 acres, most sold off during the Depression. They confirmed that the cabin had initially been a simple one-room structure, with additions made over successive generations as the Thompson family grew. Most surprisingly, the historian brought a rolled tube containing the original hand-drawn plans for the second-phase expansion, dated 1902. The careful pencil drawings showed details Mason had been trying to reconstruct through educated guesswork. According to county records, the historian explained, this place served as a waypoint for travelers before the main road was completed in 1923. Sort of an unofficial inn, especially during winter when the high passes could be snowed in for weeks. This explained certain peculiarities of the floor plan, the multiple small bedrooms upstairs, the oversized kitchen space, the large root cellar that seemed excessive for a single family. Mason spent evenings poring over the documents, integrating this new information into his restoration plans. What had begun as a structural project was evolving into something more nuanced. Not just rebuilding a cabin, but reviving a place that had served a purpose in the community's development. He added notes to his sketches. Preserve travelers' room configurations, restore wallpaper pattern in parlor, rebuild porch to original specifications. The cabin was speaking through its artifacts, revealing a history richer than he'd imagined. One morning, Mason found himself standing in what had been the main gathering room, the letters and plans spread around him. He felt a deepening responsibility, not just to the physical structure, but to the generations who had lived, welcomed strangers, raised families, and created memories within these walls. "I hear you," he said softly to the empty room. "I'll get it right." The cast-iron wood stove arrived on Tom's truck, wrapped in moving blankets and secured with ratchet straps. A relic from the 1930s, it had been collecting dust in his cousin's barn for decades. Its nickel trim gleamed dully beneath years of tarnish, and one leg had been inexpertly repaired with welding that would need refinishing. "Figured you could use this more than the Historical Society," Tom said as they maneuvered it into the cabin. Nearly identical to what the Thompsons had, judging from those photographs. Mason ran his hand over the stove's curved top, already imagining the warmth it would provide when restored. "It's perfect. I'll clean it up and get the chimney ready." The stove's arrival coincided with the first frost warning of the season, a full month earlier than normal. Mason had been tracking the weather obsessively, knowing he was in a race against winter. The roof was only partially repaired. The north wall remained vulnerable to wind, and proper windows were still weeks away from installation. "You planning to stay out here when snow flies?" Joe asked during a weekend work session, eyeing Mason's increasingly weather-beaten tent. "Have to," Mason replied. "Can't afford rent in town and materials for this place." The volunteers exchanged glances. Mason pretended not to notice. Days shortened noticeably as October progressed. Mason worked from dawn until his headlamp batteries faded each night, prioritizing weather-tight construction over aesthetics. The weekend crew now arrived bundled in flannel and insulated vests, their breath visible in the morning air. Progress accelerated with the sense of urgency. The roof gained new cedar shakes, hand-split to match the originals. The most vulnerable walls received temporary plywood sheathing that could be replaced with proper materials come spring. Mason installed the wood stove and carefully rebuilt its chimney connection, following Rebecca's historical photographs for accuracy. "You'll need at least 4 cords of seasoned wood to make it through winter up here," Harold advised, surveying Mason's meager woodpile. "And not green wood. It won't burn hot enough when the real cold sets in." Mason nodded, adding another item to his dwindling budget. The project had consumed his savings faster than anticipated, forcing him to take weekend carpentry jobs in town. The extra work meant less time on the cabin, but provided essential income for winter preparations. The weekend before Halloween, Mason woke to an unfamiliar silence. He unzipped his tent to find the world transformed. 4 inches of wet snow blanketed the property, bending saplings and outlining every branch against the grey sky. Far earlier than forecast, the first winter storm had arrived without warning. Mason rushed to the cabin, heart sinking as he found snow drifted through the still unfinished sections. The northwest corner, scheduled for repair the following week, had allowed a sizable drift to form along the interior wall. He spent the morning sweeping out snow and covering vulnerable areas with tarps, all while watching more flakes accumulate outside. By afternoon, the snow had stopped, but the temperature continued dropping. The forecast on Mason's phone showed a week of below-freezing nights ahead, the persistent cold snap that sometimes preceded Appalachian winters. That evening, Mason lit the newly installed wood stove for the first time. The seasoning oil on its surface burned off with an acrid smell, but soon the iron radiated a comforting heat that took the edge off the cabin's chill. He moved his sleeping bag inside, setting up a makeshift bed on the only section of floor that didn't leak or show signs of rot. At midnight, Mason woke to pitch darkness and penetrating cold. The fire had died completely, and the temperature inside the cabin now matched the 20-degree night outside. His phone showed no signal. The storm had knocked out the nearest cell tower. When he tried to restart the fire, the kindling smoldered but wouldn't catch properly. By flashlight, Mason examined the stovepipe and discovered the problem. The temporary chimney cap had shifted, nearly blocking the flue. With fingers numbing rapidly, he pulled on boots and coat, found his ladder, and climbed onto the partially finished roof. The metal cap had iced over completely and required careful prying to adjust. Returning inside, Mason rebuilt the fire with frozen hands, a process that took 3 painful attempts before flames finally caught. He huddled before the stove as feeling gradually returned to his extremities, bringing the sharp pins and needles sensation of warming frostbite. The experience was a stark reminder of his vulnerability. One night of serious cold had nearly resulted in disaster. What would happen during the sustained freezes of January and February? Dawn brought another unwelcome surprise. The weight of wet snow had caused a section of newly installed roofing to sag dangerously. The temporary supports Mason had placed weren't sufficient for winter snow loads. As he worked to reinforce the compromise area, Mason's phone chimed with a weather alert. A major winter storm was approaching, expected to bring 8 to 12 inches of snow within 48 hours. Looking at his partially finished cabin, with its mixture of new work and gaping vulnerabilities, Mason understood he was no longer racing against winter. Winter had arrived, and now survival would compete with restoration for his limited resources and energy. Mason spread the bank statements across his makeshift desk, a door balanced on sawhorses in the only corner of the cabin that stayed reliably dry. The numbers told a stark story. His account had dwindled to 3 digits, with winter's most demanding month still ahead. The early snowstorm had forced costly adaptations. Emergency insulation, additional roofing materials, proper chimney installation, and enough seasoned firewood to last until spring had devoured his remaining budget. The last statement showed just $427.83, not enough for the essential structural lumber he'd need to reinforce the second floor before he could safely work there. He sipped lukewarm coffee, reviewing his increasingly threadbare options. Credit cards were already stretched to their limits. His truck needed new tires to navigate winter mountain roads, another expense he couldn't postpone. The part-time carpentry work in town helped, but barely covered ongoing expenses. Mason reached for his phone and reluctantly dialed his father. "The cabin project's going well," he began, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I've hit a temporary cash flow issue. I was wondering if I might borrow—" "Son," his father interrupted gently, "your mother and I are supporting your sister through nursing school. We're stretched pretty thin ourselves." Mason swallowed his pride. "Even 1,000 would help get me through." "We don't have it, Mason." The regret in his father's voice was genuine. "Maybe it's time to consider whether this project is practical right now. No shame in stepping back and saving up for a few years." After they hung up, Mason sat in silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove. Abandoning the cabin now would mean watching winter undo everything he'd accomplished. Without someone tending the stove, pipes would freeze and burst. Snow would accumulate on the partially finished roof until something gave way. By spring, the damage would likely be irreparable. The next morning, Mason drove to town before dawn, arriving at the local lumber yard just as they opened. "Looking for work," he told the yard manager without preamble. "A part-time, weekends, whatever you've got. I'm certified for the forklift, experienced with all your inventory, and can handle customer service." By noon, he'd secured 20 hours weekly at the lumberyard, in addition to his existing carpentry jobs. The combined schedule meant working 7 days a week, often 14 hours a day, with a treacherous mountain commute between job sites. 2 weeks into this punishing routine, Mason fell asleep at the wheel, waking just in time to avoid drifting into a ravine. The near miss forced a re-evaluation. He couldn't maintain this pace through winter without risking his life. That weekend, despite exhaustion pulling at his bones, Mason welcomed his regular volunteers to the cabin. As they worked to secure the structure against the latest forecasted storm, he finally admitted his financial situation. "I've got good news and bad news," he told them during lunch break. "Good news is I've made enough for the essential structural materials. Bad news is there's nothing left for the historical details we've been planning. No custom-milled trim, no period-appropriate hardware. None of the finishing touches that would make this place authentic. The group exchanged looks Mason couldn't interpret. "Show us your materials list," Tom finally said. "The essential items you need right now." Mason handed over his carefully calculated inventory of lumber, fasteners, and weatherproofing materials. Tom studied it, then passed it around the circle. Without discussion, the volunteers began calling out items. "I've got 20 board feet of oak that would cover this flooring section," said Joe. "My cousin's demolishing a 1910 farmhouse," added Mike. "I can salvage period window frames that would fit your openings." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "The Historical Society has a storage barn full of donated architectural elements. I'm sure we could find appropriate door hardware and some of these other specialty items." Mason started to object, but Tom raised a hand to stop him. "Nobody's giving charity here. This is how mountain communities have always worked, resource sharing. Your grandpa would have understood that." That evening, after everyone left, Rebecca returned alone, carrying a laptop. "The younger folks set up something you should see," she said, opening the computer to show a simple web page titled
"Save the Thompson Cabin." The
online fundraiser included photographs of the project's progress and an explanation of its historical significance to the community. In 3 days, it had already raised nearly $1,200 from small donations, mostly from local families. "People are invested in what you're doing here," Rebecca explained. "This place matters beyond just being your home. It's part of our shared heritage." Mason stared at the screen, throat tight with unexpected emotion. Names of donors included many he recognized. The cashier at the general store, Harold Jenkins. Families he'd only met in passing through town. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. Rebecca closed the laptop with a smile. "Around here we don't say much. We just do what needs doing." After she left, Mason returned to his bank statements, adding a new column for projected community contributions. For the first time in weeks, the numbers suggested possibility rather than defeat. The final replacement beam, 16 feet of hand-hewn oak, required 6 people to maneuver into position. Mason guided from above, balanced on the newly reinforced joists, while Tom and the weekend crew steadied the massive timber from below. The beam represented the culmination of 3 months' work, the last major structural element needed to make the cabin sound. "Little to the left," Mason called, aligning the beam with mortises cut to receive its tenoned ends. "Another inch, there." The beam settled into place with a satisfying thud. Mason drove the oak pegs through pre-drilled holes, securing the joint in the same manner as the original builders had done a century earlier. No nails, no screws, just precisely fitted wood, locked together through skilled joinery. "That's it," he announced, voice echoing in the newly open interior space. "Main structural work is complete." A spontaneous cheer rose from the work crew. This milestone had seemed impossible during December's brutal storms and January's financial hardships. Yet somehow, through community support, resource sharing, and stubborn persistence, the cabin now stood structurally sound. The roof no longer leaked. The foundation sat firm and level. The walls stood straight against winter winds. Ben, Pete's grandson, home from preservation studies, documented the moment with his camera. "This is textbook restoration work," he said, capturing details of the joinery. "My professors would be impressed with how authentic you've kept the methods." The celebration continued through lunch, a potluck feast spread on improvised tables in what would eventually become the cabin's main living space. Rebecca brought a cake decorated with a miniature cabin fashioned from graham crackers. Harold, rarely seen without his walking stick these days, produced a bottle of moonshine that he swore had been made according to Thompson's own recipe. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Mason found himself standing alone in the center of the main room, taking in the transformation. 3 months earlier, he could look up from this spot and see sky through the collapsed roof. Now solid rafters supported a weather-tight covering. Walls that had leaned dangerously now stood plumb. Floorboards that had rotted through had been replaced with carefully matched antique pine. some salvaged from century-old barns being demolished elsewhere in the county. Tom joined him, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Not bad for a winter's work," he observed. "Couldn't have done it without everyone's help," Mason replied. "You provided something just as valuable," Tom said. "Opportunity. Folks around here have skills passed down through generations, but fewer places to apply them each year. This project let people do what they know how to do best." As the volunteers departed for the evening, Mason received handshakes, backslaps, and promises to return for the interior work ahead. The community that had initially viewed him with skepticism now treated him as one of their own, a steward of local heritage rather than an outsider with unrealistic dreams. After the last truck disappeared down the drive, Mason built up the wood stove fire against the evening chill. Though technically still camping in his own home, a sleeping bag on a mattress in the corner, minimal furnishings, most possessions still in storage, tonight felt different. For the first time, he would sleep within truly secure walls, beneath a roof he trusted to withstand whatever weather might come. Mason unrolled his sleeping bag on the new floor, struck by the contrast between his first night on the property, huddled in his truck during a thunderstorm, questioning his decision, and tonight's well-earned comfort. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut wood, linseed oil, and wood smoke, honest smells of creation and preservation rather than decay. His phone chimed with a message from his father. "Saw the online photos. Looks like you're proving all the doubters wrong. Grandpa would be proud." Mason smiled, typing back, "Still a long way to go, but the backbone is solid now." Later, lying in his sleeping bag and watching firelight play across newly exposed ceiling beams, Mason listened to the cabin settling around him. Unlike before, when each creak and groan signaled potential collapse, tonight's sounds felt like conversation, a structure reintroducing itself after being properly awakened from decades of neglect. The winter had tested his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. Financial strain, physical exhaustion, isolation, and the elements had all conspired to make him abandon his vision. Yet here he was, on the other side of those challenges, with the most critical work complete. Tomorrow would bring new tasks: window installation, interior wall finishing, planning for utilities that balanced modern needs with historical integrity. But those challenges seemed manageable now that the fundamentals were secure. Mason drifted towards sleep, mind already mapping out the next day's work. The last thought before consciousness faded was simple satisfaction. The Thompson cabin would stand for another century, and he had played his part in making that possible. Mason knelt on the floor, working the edge of his pry bar beneath decades of accumulated coverings. The modern vinyl peeled away reluctantly, revealing a layer of linoleum from the 1950s, which in turn concealed older flooring beneath. He worked methodically across the room, carefully lifting each historical layer. Like archaeology, Ben commented, photographing the process for his university project. Each floor tells a story about how people lived. The vinyl represented practical post-war America, cheap, durable, easy to clean. The patterned linoleum beneath spoke of mid-century aspirations toward modernity. But what truly interested Mason lay beneath both: the original wide-plank pine flooring that had supported generations of Thompson family life. As the final section of linoleum pulled away, the room's original floor emerged like a portrait restored. 6-inch wide planks of heart pine, glowing amber even beneath years of grime. Mason ran his hand over the surface, feeling the subtle undulations created by foot traffic concentrated in pathways between door, hearth, and windows. These boards were already ancient when they were milled, he explained to Ben. Look at the growth rings, so tight you can barely distinguish them. Old-growth timber that might have been standing since before European settlement. Unlike modern lumber, these planks had been cut from the heart of mature trees, making them naturally resistant to rot and insects. Where modern pine floors might have disintegrated after decades of neglect, these had protected themselves with their own oils and resins. Worth saving? Ben asked. Absolutely, Mason replied without hesitation. They'll need careful cleaning and some repair work, but there's another century of life in this floor if we treat it properly. As spring warmth finally penetrated the mountain hollow, interior work accelerated. With the structure now secure, Mason could focus on uncovering and preserving original elements that gave the cabin its character. Each day brought new discoveries as he carefully stripped away later modifications to reveal historical craftsmanship beneath. Behind makeshift built-in cabinets from the 1960s, Mason found the original wainscoting, beadboard paneling that had protected lower walls from damage. Above doorways, he discovered hand-carved wooden lintels with simple but elegant details. Inside closets and cabinets, original paint colors remained vibrant where they'd been protected from light, rich ochres, deep blues, and warm reds that reflected both available pigments and period tastes. Most revealing were the markings left by builders and residents over decades. In the corner of what had been a child's bedroom, pencil marks tracked heights with dates from 1923 to 1942. On a ceiling beam, Mason found carved initials and the date, May 12, 1911, likely commemorating some long-forgotten milestone. Inside a door frame, a series of notches appeared to record snowfall depths from particularly memorable winters. One afternoon, while carefully removing damaged plaster, Mason uncovered a section of wall where someone had written directly on the wooden lath beneath. Robert Thompson, Jr. leaves for Army training. June 18, 1967. God, keep him safe. Mason stood motionless before this intimate glimpse into the family's history, the father's prayer for his son who, according to Harold, would never return from Vietnam. He decided on the spot that this section of wall would remain visible beneath a frame of glass, preserving both craftsmanship and memory. As the cabin's interior emerged from beneath its accumulated layers, Mason refined his restoration philosophy. Rather than returning the structure to a single historical period, he would honor its evolution through time, preserving elements from different eras when they represented quality craftsmanship or significant family history. The main living areas would reflect the cabin's early 20th century prime, when it had served as both family home and occasional travelers' rest. One bedroom would preserve elements from the 1940s, when the last generation of Thompsons had modernized their living space. The kitchen would acknowledge both original features and practical modern needs, creating a usable space that respected historical context. Rebecca approved of this approach during her weekly visits. That's how families really lived, she noted. Nobody threw everything out each generation. They adapted, added what they needed, kept what still worked. The cabin's emerging personality became a conversation between past and present. Original wide plank floors would remain visible, cleaned and finished with traditional oils, rather than modern polyurethane. Hand-hewn beams would stay exposed, rather than hidden behind drywall. Yet discrete electrical outlets would provide modern convenience without disrupting historical aesthetics. Plumbing would be integrated thoughtfully, respecting original layouts while providing contemporary function. Mason found himself spending evenings simply sitting in different parts of the cabin, absorbing its rhythms and proportions. He noticed how the original builders had oriented windows to capture seasonal light angles, how room layouts encouraged natural movement patterns, how even the placement of the hearth created ideal air circulation. They didn't have architectural software, he explained to Ben during a particularly insightful discovery about the roof pitch. But they understood how buildings worked with nature instead of fighting against it. This deepening appreciation influenced every decision. When choosing between modern efficiency and historical accuracy, Mason increasingly found himself asking not what would be easiest, but what the original builders would have done if given today's resources while maintaining their core principles of craftsmanship and harmony with the environment. Rebecca Jenkins arrived, carrying a leather-bound book wrapped in a dish towel, handling it with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. "Found something you might appreciate," she said, setting it carefully on Mason's workbench. The handwritten cookbook opened to reveal elegant script, pages yellowed with age and spotted with ingredient stains. Elizabeth Thompson's recipes passed through generations. My mother received it from Bobby's mother after he died, since there were no Thompson daughters left to inherit it. Mason turned pages filled with instructions for hearty mountain fare, medicinal preparations and household concoctions, everything from blackberry cordial to lye soap. Margin notes chronicled adaptations across decades. Sugar scarce, use honey instead, 1943, and add tomatoes from Victory Garden, 1918. This belongs in a museum, Mason said, carefully closing the book. It belongs in this cabin, Rebecca corrected him. These recipes were developed in that very hearth. The ingredients grew in the garden you're restoring. The meals fed travelers who sheltered here during storms. She pushed it toward him. Knowledge should live where it was born. The cookbook became the first in a series of knowledge transfers that transformed Mason's approach to the restoration. What began as a primarily physical reconstruction evolved into an education in traditional practices, integral to the cabin's original function. Harold Jenkins spent afternoons teaching Mason about the property's natural resources. They walked the perimeter, identifying plants the Thompson family would have used. Chickweed for spring salads, jewelweed for treating poison ivy, golden seal for medicinal tinctures. Harold pointed out stone arrangements that marked boundaries, established through handshake agreements with neighbors long before formal surveys. That pile means shared spring, he explained, indicating a particular rock formation. Thompson's and my family's people both had water rights there. Tom the blacksmith began weekly lessons in the traditional metalworking techniques needed to create historically accurate hardware. Under his guidance, Mason learned to forge simple hinges, latches, and nails that matched original pieces too damaged to salvage. Factory-made stuff would be cheaper and faster, Tom acknowledged as Mason struggled with a particularly ornery piece of iron. But it wouldn't belong to this place the way hand-forged work does. Most valuable were the plastering lessons from Sarah Lewis, whose family had maintained the skill for generations. She taught Mason how to mix lime plaster using local materials, apply it in traditional three-coat technique, and finish it with pigments derived from regional clay deposits. Modern drywall would look wrong here, Sarah explained, demonstrating how to work the final coat to achieve subtle texture variations. These old walls need to breathe with the seasons, expand and contract with temperature changes. Lime plaster moves with the building instead of fighting against it. During lunch breaks, stories flowed as freely as the sweet tea Rebecca always brought. Harold recalled Thompson family traditions, how they always planted potatoes on Good Friday, regardless of weather, how they predicted winter severity by measuring hornets' nest heights, how they maintained specific arrangements with neighbors for shared labor during harvest and butchering seasons. Mason absorbed these narratives, like the lime plaster absorbed pigment, letting them color his understanding of the cabin beyond mere structural considerations. He began seeing the restoration not just as rebuilding a physical space, but reviving a way of life that had balanced self-sufficiency with community interdependence. The knowledge sharing flowed both ways. While learning traditional methods, Mason introduced modern adaptations that honored historical principles while addressing contemporary needs. He showed Sarah how certain natural additives could improve plaster durability without compromising its breathability. He worked with Tom to design hardware that maintained traditional appearances while incorporating subtle security features. As word spread about the restoration's authenticity, more elders from surrounding communities made pilgrimages to the cabin. They arrived with stories, old photographs, and occasionally artifacts. A hand-carved butter paddle that had belonged to Elizabeth Thompson, iron cookware from the original kitchen, even a quilting frame that had reportedly produced coverings for both family beds and travelers' bunks. These visitors invariably departed, having shared some crucial knowledge that influenced Mason's work. One elderly woman explained the traditional layout of a root cellar that maximized storage life for different vegetables. A retired logger identified the specific local wood sources likely used for different structural elements. A 92-year-old former midwife described how the small north bedroom had been arranged specifically for birthing. With particular attention to light and ventilation, by late spring, Mason had become known throughout the county as more than just the young man restoring the Thompson place. Locals began referring to him as a keeper, someone preserving not just buildings, but the knowledge embedded in them. "You've changed since winter," Rebecca observed one evening as they reviewed his increasingly detailed documentation of traditional techniques. "When you started, you were restoring a cabin. Now you're preserving heritage." Mason considered this as he turned a page in Elizabeth's cookbook, studying a recipe for huckleberry. Preserves he planned to make once the berries ripened. On the ridge above the cabin, the building would just be wood and stone without the stories and skills that created it, he replied. "I'm finally learning what I actually bought, not just property, but responsibility for keeping something alive." The solar panels arrived on a sunny June morning, their sleek black surfaces incongruous against Mason's pickup truck. 4 high-efficiency modules, a battery bank, and an inverter system. Modern technology that would power a century-old home while remaining nearly invisible to visitors. "Some folks think I'm betraying the cabin's authenticity," Mason explained to Eliza Chen, the green building consultant who had helped design the system. "But I've done the research." Even the Thompsons adopted new technology when it made sense. They unloaded the equipment in a clearing behind the cabin, where Mason had constructed a small outbuilding, styled to resemble a traditional woodshed. The solar components would be housed there, connected to the cabin through underground conduit that wouldn't disturb the historical aesthetics. "It's about appropriate technology," Eliza replied, examining the site. "The original builders used the best methods available to them while working with natural constraints. You're doing the same thing, just with different options." The integration of essential modern systems into the historical structure had become Mason's most complex challenge. Each contemporary element required careful consideration. How to provide functionality without compromising authenticity, how to honor the past while acknowledging present needs. Electricity presented particular difficulties. The cabin had never had proper wiring, having been abandoned before rural electrification reached this valley. Rather than cutting into original walls for conventional installations, Mason had designed a system that utilized existing structural cavities and floor channels. Outlets were hidden behind furniture or in floor hatches crafted to match original boards. Light fixtures adapted traditional oil lamp designs to accommodate LED bulbs that mimicked warm firelight. The plumbing solutions proved equally creative. Rather than disturbing original floor joists with conventional drain lines, Mason had worked with a sustainable systems engineer to design a grey water management approach that utilized historical water flow patterns while meeting modern code requirements. The cabin's original rainwater collection system had been restored and enhanced with contemporary filtration that remained tucked beneath the eaves. People lived here for generations, without running water or electricity. Tom had reminded him during a particularly frustrating planning session. Don't sacrifice history for convenience you could live without. But they used what made sense for their time, Mason had countered. They weren't deliberately primitive. They'd have used better technology if they'd had access to it. This philosophical tension informed every decision. Mason studied historical photographs obsessively, noting how the Thompson family had incorporated innovations of their eras, a telephone line added in the 1940s, a refrigerator replacing the icebox in the 1950s, indoor plumbing gradually introduced through the decades. For his modern adaptations, Mason established strict criteria. Any technology incorporated must be as unobtrusive as possible, must not permanently alter original structure, and must align with the sustainability principles that had guided the original homesteaders. The solar system perfectly embodied this approach. Clean energy would power minimal modern necessities without connecting the property to the grid, maintaining the cabin's traditional self-sufficiency while acknowledging contemporary life. The panels would generate enough electricity for basic lighting, refrigeration, and occasional power tool use without enabling energy-intensive appliances that would have seemed alien to the property's history. "I've worked on dozens of historic renovations," Eliza commented as they positioned the battery system. "Most people either go completely modern inside a preserved shell, or they create museum pieces nobody could actually live in. Your balanced approach is refreshing." Throughout the property, this thoughtful integration continued. The original root cellar had been cleaned and reinforced, now serving its traditional food storage purpose while incorporating discrete temperature and humidity monitors. The hand-dug well had been tested, cleaned, and fitted with a simple pump that could operate both manually and with solar power. Even communications technology followed this principle of hidden modernization. A small satellite internet receiver perched behind the chimney, nearly invisible from ground level, providing connectivity that Mason increasingly relied upon for research and documentation of his restoration methods. Ben, visiting from his preservation studies program, captured these innovations for his thesis project. "You're essentially creating a case study in adaptive preservation," he observed, photographing the traditional exterior that gave no hint of the carefully integrated systems within. Honoring historical methods while selectively incorporating appropriate contemporary elements. As they activated the solar system for the first time, Mason watched the battery monitor display climb steadily. The cabin was now generating its own electricity, just as it had once produced its own food, medicine, and building materials. Different methods, same philosophy of self-sufficiency. That evening, Mason sat on the restored front porch, a single LED lantern providing light as he reviewed construction plans for the final phases. The solar batteries hummed softly in their shed, charging during these long summer days to prepare for future needs. Inside, the refrigerator preserved food without the ice deliveries the Thompsons would have depended on. Behind the cabin, the satellite silently connected this isolated hollow to the wider world. None of these modern elements announced themselves. They served without disrupting the cabin's essential character, tools rather than features, just as the original builders would have viewed their own innovations. The integrity of Thompson cabin remained intact, not as a frozen moment in time, but as a living space that continued its long conversation between human needs and natural possibilities. The photographs lay side by side on Mason's workbench, before and after images that documented not just the cabin's rebirth, but his own evolution. The first photo, taken on purchase day, showed a pale, somewhat soft-looking young man standing uncertainly before a collapsing structure. The recent image captured a leaner, weathered version of himself, confidence evident in his stance beside sturdy, restored walls. "Hardly recognize yourself, do you?" Harold observed, glancing over Mason's shoulder as he organized the project documentation. Mason studied the images, noting changes beyond the physical. The hesitancy in his earlier expression had been replaced by quiet certainty. His hands, once relatively smooth, now bore calluses and healed cuts from countless hours of physical labor. Even his posture had transformed, more upright, grounded, as if he'd settled into his own skin. "The cabin's not the only thing being rebuilt," he acknowledged. 9 months into the restoration, Mason hardly resembled the person who had emptied his savings account for an abandoned structure. The changes went far beyond appearance. Skills he'd once struggled with now felt like natural extensions of his body, reading the grain of wood to anticipate how it would split, sensing by sound alone when a beam had settled properly into position, judging by touch whether plaster had reached the right consistency. His problem-solving approach had evolved too. Early in the project, each unexpected challenge had triggered anxiety and doubt. Now he met complications with patient assessment, drawing on accumulated knowledge and growing instinct. When the discovery of hidden termite damage threatened a crucial support wall, Mason had systematically evaluated options, devised a solution that preserved historical elements while ensuring structural integrity, and implemented repairs without the panic such setbacks once provoked. Rebecca had noticed this transformation during their regular historical research sessions. "You've developed what the old folks called mountain patience," she told him, understanding that some processes can't be rushed and some problems need to reveal their own solutions. This patience extended beyond the physical restoration. Mason now appreciated the rhythms that governed life in this mountain hollow, the particular slant of seasonal light that determined when certain work became possible, the weather patterns that influenced wood behavior, the cycles of local plants that provided natural indicators for timing various projects. His connection to the community had deepened correspondingly. What began as occasional assistance had evolved into meaningful collaboration and genuine friendship. Mason now participated in town events, contributed to local preservation efforts beyond his own property, and had become a regular at the Sunday gatherings at Harold's, place where neighbors shared meals and maintained the traditions of Appalachian storytelling. The financial struggles that once threatened the project had stabilized through this community integration. Mason's reputation for quality craftsmanship had spread, bringing requests for specialized restoration work that he could schedule around his own cabin project. Local people recommended him for preservation grants that supported both his work and documentation of traditional building methods. A regional magazine had published a feature on the Thompson cabin restoration, drawing visitors who sometimes made donations to support the effort they now viewed as cultural heritage preservation rather than one man's project. Most significantly, Mason's sense of purpose had crystallized. What began as a desire to create something lasting had matured into a deeper understanding of stewardship, the responsibility to preserve not just physical structures, but the knowledge, the values and connections they represented. "I've been thinking," Mason told Harold as they organized the photo documentation, "about offering apprenticeship opportunities once the main restoration is complete. Teaching young people the traditional methods we've been using here." Harold nodded approvingly. "Knowledge dies if it isn't passed along. These old ways of building, they're not just quaint traditions. They're solutions developed over generations of working with these specific mountains, these specific materials." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a state preservation official, making her quarterly visit to document the project for inclusion in the Register of Historical Structures. Mason walked her through recent progress, explaining the techniques and materials with the quiet authority that now characterized his discussions of the work. "Your documentation is impressive," she noted, reviewing his detailed records of each restoration decision. "Most private restorers don't maintain this level of historical accountability." "I'm not just doing this for myself," Mason explained. "This place has stories that deserve to be preserved accurately." Later, after the official departed, Mason returned to his comparison of the before and after photographs. He added a third image to the sequence, a sketch of the cabin as it would appear when fully restored, surrounded by renewed gardens and orchards. The drawing represented not just a finished structure, but a vision of integrated living that balanced historical reverence with contemporary viability. "Who would have thought," he mused to himself, "that rebuilding a cabin meant rebuilding myself too?" Mason stood before the half-finished door, running his fingers along the grain of the walnut he'd selected for this final signature element. The front entrance would be the first thing visitors encountered, the threshold between outside world and restored sanctuary. He'd saved this task for last, a culminating piece that would embody everything he'd learned throughout the restoration. "Walnut's a bold choice," Tom observed from the workbench where he was putting final touches on custom hinges. Most folks around here used oak or pine. Thomas Thompson used walnut for the original, Mason replied, indicating the historical photograph pinned to his design board. Rebecca found documentation that he'd saved this particular tree for years, waiting for the right project. The door design honored the original while incorporating subtle improvements. Mason had studied traditional joinery methods to create a structure that would withstand decades of seasonal changes without warping. He'd included period-appropriate details, hand-carved panels featuring local flora, precise proportioning based on historical examples, and a slight arch that echoed the cabin's interior doorways. No nails, no screws, he explained to Ben, who had returned to document the final phase of restoration. Just precise joinery and wooden pegs like the original builders used. Every aspect of the cabin was now receiving this level of attention to detail. After nearly a year of work focused primarily on structural integrity and weatherproofing, Mason had shifted to the aesthetic elements that would transform a sound building into a home. Inside, final plastering touched the walls with warm, natural tones derived from local clay deposits. Sarah Lewis had taught Mason to incorporate subtle color variations that caught light differently throughout the day, creating walls that seemed to breathe with the changing sun. The Thompsons would have whitewashed most interior walls, Rebecca had noted during a planning session, and later generations added color as materials became available, Mason had replied, showing her samples that represented different historical periods. They had ultimately decided on a progression of finishes that honored the cabin's evolution. Original whitewash in the oldest section, period-appropriate colors in later additions. The restored hearth formed the cabin's literal and symbolic heart. Mason had rebuilt the damaged chimney stone by stone, reusing original materials where possible and sourcing matching local stone for necessary replacements. The mantelpiece, hand-hewn chestnut salvaged from a collapsed period barn, had been finished with traditional milk paint following Rebecca's family recipes. Floor restoration had consumed weeks of painstaking work. Mason had carefully cleaned the original wide-plank pine flooring, repairing damaged sections with salvaged period materials that matched both species and age. Rather than modern polyurethane, he'd finished the floors with a traditional mixture of beeswax and linseed oil, applied in thin layers that built up a warm patina while allowing the wood to continue its natural aging process. Outside, landscape restoration had proceeded with equal attention to historical accuracy. Harold had guided Mason in identifying remnant plantings from the original homestead, heritage apple trees nearly hidden by volunteer growth, perennial herbs that had survived decades of neglect. Even raspberry canes descended from Elizabeth Thompson's carefully tended kitchen garden. Plants tell the story of who lived here and how they sustained themselves, Harold explained as they cleared overgrowth from around a gnarly apple tree. This variety was popular for cider making before Prohibition. Thomas Jr. likely planted it himself. Mason had incorporated these living artifacts into a landscape plan that balanced historical accuracy with sustainable maintenance. The kitchen garden had been re-established using heritage seeds consistent with what the Thompson family would have grown. Original pathways had been uncovered and restored with local stone. The fruit orchard had been carefully pruned and supplemented with historically appropriate varieties grafted from surviving local trees. As he worked on the door carving, Mason found himself reflecting on how his approach had evolved throughout the project. What began as a primarily technical challenge, making a deteriorated structure sound again, had developed into something more holistic, the revival of a living system that connected building, landscape, and human purpose. The cabin now stood as both artifact and environment, telling its story through every carefully considered detail. Hand-forged hardware spoke of traditional craftsmanship. Period-appropriate textiles recalled domestic life across generations. Even the arrangement of furniture, some original pieces returned by community members, others carefully recreated, reflected how the space had functioned throughout its history. "It's never really finished, is it?" Rebecca observed during her weekly visit, watching Mason work on the door carving. "That's what I've come to understand," he replied. "The original builders never saw it as done either. They were always adapting, improving, responding to changing needs." As evening approached, Mason set aside his carving tools and walked the perimeter of the property. From the outside, the cabin now appeared much as it had in photographs from its prime, a sturdy, welcoming structure that belonged to its landscape. The restored metal roof gleamed in the setting sun. Rebuilt stone chimneys stood straight and true. The porch, reconstructed according to historical specifications, invited lingering on summer evenings. Only subtle details revealed the building's recent rebirth, the slightly brighter color of new chinking between logs, the just-planted fruit trees among their gnarled ancestors, the carefully hidden solar panels that powered minimal modern conveniences. Mason returned to the walnut door, running his hand over the day's carving progress. When complete, this threshold would mark not just entry to a restored historical structure, but passage into a renewed way of living that honored both past and future. The leather-bound guest book lay open on a small table beside the newly installed front door. Its first page, headed with simple calligraphy, "Thompson Cabin Rebirth, June 21st, 2023. Mason had commissioned it from a local bookbinder, wanting a tangible record of this milestone day when the cabin would officially transition from restoration project to living home. Sunshine filtered through newly installed period-appropriate windows, casting honeyed light across wide plank floors that gleamed with beeswax polish. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with linseed oil and wood smoke from the small fire crackling in the restored hearth, not needed for warmth on this summer day, but lit ceremonially to reclaim the heart of the home. Outside, vehicles began arriving. First, the regular weekend volunteers who had become family over the past year. Then a steady stream of community members who had contributed knowledge, materials, or simply encouragement during the long restoration process. They gathered in the cleared yard where Mason had erected a tent, bringing covered dishes and stories to share. "Hard to believe this is the same place," Joe commented, examining the restored porch railings he'd helped install. "Remember when we could see daylight through the roof?" Rebecca arrived with her extensive collection of historical photographs, now organized into albums documenting the cabin's evolution from original construction through its decline and renewal. She'd arranged them alongside Mason's detailed restoration photographs, creating a visual narrative of rebirth that captivated visitors. Harold, moving slower these days but determined to participate fully, performed an impromptu blessing of the space, not formally religious, but deeply spiritual in its mountain tradition. "May this place shelter those who respect its history," he intoned, "and may its walls remember the hands that built and rebuilt them." Mason's parents made the drive from their home 40 miles north, his father examining the craftsmanship with newfound respect. "Your grandfather would have approved," he said simply, running calloused fingers along a perfectly fitted joint. This is the kind of work he believed in. The County Historical Society president presented Mason with an official plaque designating Thompson Cabin as a registered historical structure worthy of preservation. "What you've accomplished here goes beyond saving a building," she noted. "You've preserved techniques and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to our community." As afternoon progressed to evening, Mason led small groups through the cabin, explaining the restoration process and highlighting original features that had been preserved or uncovered. He found himself sharing not just technical details, but the stories embedded in each element, which beams had come from trees likely cut by Thomas Thompson himself, which floorboards showed wear patterns from generations of family footsteps, which window frames contained pencil marks, recording children's heights across decades. The local newspaper photographer captured images for a feature article, focusing particularly on the blend of historical authenticity and sustainable adaptations that characterized the restoration. "You've created something that looks to both past and future," she observed. Not many restoration projects manage that balance. Near sunset, Tom called for everyone's attention, producing a small wooden box that the weekend crew presented to Mason. Inside lay a hand-forged iron key, created using traditional blacksmithing methods. It's symbolic, of course, Tom explained. The original doors wouldn't have had locks this sophisticated, but we wanted you to have something that represented opening the next chapter. Mason accepted the key with unexpected emotion, suddenly aware of the transition this gathering represented. What had begun as his solitary project had become a community endeavor, and now stood complete, or as complete as a living historical structure ever could be. I couldn't have done this alone, he acknowledged, looking around at the gathered faces. This cabin has always been about community. From when Thomas Thompson first raised these walls with neighbors' help, through all the travelers who found shelter here, to everyone who contributed to its rebirth. As darkness fell, lanterns illuminated the yard, where conversation and laughter continued. Inside, Mason lit traditional oil lamps, alongside the discreet LED fixtures that provided supplementary light. The cabin glowed from within, reclaiming its role as a beacon of habitation in the mountain hollow. Later, as guests departed with promises to return for future gatherings, Mason found Rebecca lingering by the guest book, examining the pages now filled with signatures and messages. The Thompson family would be pleased, she said, running her finger along entries from descendants of original neighbors. They built this place to last generations, and now it will. Mason nodded, thinking of the cabin's journey from abandoned shell to renewed home. The best form of preservation is continued use, he replied, recalling something he'd read early in the project. This place will keep evolving, but its essence remains. After the final guest departed, Mason stood alone in the main room, listening to the cabin's nighttime sounds, the gentle settling of timbers, the soft ticking of cooling stovepipes, the whisper of breeze through open windows. For the first time, these sounds spoke not of a structure in process, but of a home reclaiming its purpose. He signed his name in the guest book as both restorer and new steward, adding a simple note beneath, not an ending, but a continuation. Dawn filtered through restored windows, casting dappled light across Mason's face as he woke in his own bed for the first time. Not the temporary sleeping arrangement he'd used during construction, but a proper bed frame he'd built from local cherry, positioned exactly where the Thompson family had placed theirs, according to historical photographs. He lay still, listening to the cabin's morning sounds, different from its nighttime voice. Timber expanding gently in growing warmth, birds calling from the rejuvenated orchard. The distant murmur of the spring that had drawn Thomas Thompson to this hollow over a century ago. This was his first morning as a resident rather than a restorer. The celebration had marked a threshold, after which his relationship with the cabin fundamentally changed. No longer a project to complete, but a home to inhabit. No longer a structure requiring rescue, but a living space continuing its evolution. Mason followed the morning routine he'd established during the final weeks of restoration, stoking the wood stove, brewing coffee in the restored kitchen using water from the spring-fed well, stepping onto the porch to assess the day's weather and possibilities. But today these actions carried different significance. They weren't preparations for construction work, but the rhythms of daily life resuming in a space designed for exactly such ordinary moments. After breakfast, Mason walked the perimeter of his property with a canvas bag containing dozens of seedlings, native plants propagated from existing specimens on the mountain. Along the restored stone borders of the original garden plots, he knelt repeatedly to plant each seedling according to the landscape plan he'd developed with Harold's guidance. Mountain herbs that the Thompson family would have used for cooking and medicine. Berry bushes descended from wild stock that had sustained generations through winter months. Flower varieties mentioned in Elizabeth Thompson's letters as particular favorites. Each planting represented an investment in continuity, roots literally and figuratively anchoring the restored property to its future. Unlike the urgency that had characterized the building restoration, these plantings acknowledged a longer timeline. Many would take years to mature. Some would outlive him entirely. The oak saplings he positioned at the property corners might not reach their prime for a century or more. Midday brought visitors, not unexpected, as the community had embraced the cabin's restoration as a shared achievement. Rebecca arrived with additional historical documents she'd uncovered. Tom stopped by with a reproduction of an antique weather vane he thought would complement the restored roofline. Sarah brought seedlings from her family's heirloom vegetable garden to contribute to the kitchen plot Mason had prepared. Their visits no longer centered around work to be done, but possibilities to be explored. Conversations drifted naturally to future gatherings the space might host. Traditional crafts that might be taught here, seasonal celebrations that might revive historical community traditions. The Historical Society is interested in using this place for their youth education program, Rebecca mentioned as they walked the newly restored pathways. Teaching children about mountain lifeways before they're entirely forgotten. I've been thinking about apprenticeships, Mason replied. Finding young people interested in learning traditional building methods while helping maintain the place. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Mason's final visitor arrived. Ben, now graduated from his preservation program and beginning a career with the State Historical Commission. He carried professional camera equipment to document the completed restoration for archives and publications. This project has already become a case study in my department, Ben explained as they toured the property. Not just for the technical restoration aspects, but for how it's engaged the community in preservation of intangible heritage, the knowledge and practices beyond the physical structure. Later, after all visitors had departed, Mason sat alone on the front porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. He'd positioned the handcrafted rocking chair precisely where Thomas Thompson had sat in century-old photographs. Viewing the same mountain ridgeline, hearing the same evening bird calls, the restored cabin stood solid behind him, neither a museum frozen in time nor a modern home that merely gestured toward history. Instead, it occupied the living middle ground, honoring its origins while embracing its continued evolution. Original walls contained discrete modern systems. Historic aesthetics accommodated contemporary function. Traditional craftsmanship incorporated sustainable adaptations. As darkness settled fully over the hollow, Mason lit a single oil lamp in the front window, a tradition mentioned in Thompson family journals as a beacon for travelers who might need shelter. Though modern highways had long since diverted such journeys elsewhere, the symbolic act connected present to past in quiet acknowledgement. Inside, Mason added a log to the wood stove and opened his journal to record the day's activities, the final entry in the Restoration Chronicle, the first in the new record of daily life at Thompson Cabin. At the top of the page, he wrote a simple heading, "First Day Home," the question that had haunted him since purchase, whether a deteriorating cabin no one wanted had been worth the investment of his savings, his labor, and ultimately a year of his life, now answered itself with quiet certainty. What he'd purchased wasn't just property but purpose. What he'd restored wasn't just a structure but a story that would continue long after he became just another chapter in its telling.